All set.
Okay, so we are officially recording. Hello and welcome everybody to the Securing Critical Projects Workgroup meeting. I'll be facilitating today. We could typically do it the way that we normally do. And again, participation and questions, anything is encouraged. Feel free to either use the raise your hand or just shout out or whatever works. It's always nice to get a good discussion going during these workgroup meetings. So to start off, we can do what we normally do and see if there are any newcomers who would like to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what brought them to the workgroup meeting and how they work with open source. Do we have anybody today?
Yes, I can go first. This is Eric Tice. I am the director of open source technical consulting and the Center of Excellence for Wipro Technologies. We do a lot of work. Obviously, we're GSI. I'm not going to sell you a sales pitch, but my team in general works a lot with open source technologies, contributes in a number of areas. And this year, we're expanding our DevSecOps part of our practice as part of the open source program office to incorporate more of the work that OpenSSF and other open source technologies are currently doing, as well as looking at building or contributing to a number of potential solutions or open source capabilities that may not yet be available in the market.
Very cool. Welcome, Eric. Yes, welcome. Thank you for joining today. Do we have anyone else?
Hi, I'm Julia Farioli. I work at the Twitter Open Source Programs Office. I am here today because I was actually one of the people who worked on the original criticality score, and looking to re-engage now that I'm a bit more settled. So it's nice to meet you all.
Very cool. Welcome, Julia. Thank you for that. Do we have anyone else? Okay, cool. Well, yes, welcome. So this is the Securing Critical Projects Work Group. I think the name is pretty succinct in terms of what the work group is working towards, why we all come to the meetings, focusing on securing what we consider to be critical projects. We're trying to figure out the best way to do that. It's quite a complicated problem. There's a lot of good work going on and collaboration, especially in the open source space. At least in my experience, typically yields better outcomes. So yeah, so we're all working towards securing open source in different ways. Typically, which might be a good way to get acquainted with some of the stuff we're working on. Typically, we like to do some project updates. So some of the initiatives that are kind of affiliated with this work group or the OpenSSF in general, we talk about. And actually, the first one that we have on our recurring themes is the criticality score. So I'm curious if you, Julia, or you, Jeff, or if anyone has any updates on the criticality score project.
Sadly, no. I'm out of date.
Okay. Anything on your end, Jeff, or anyone else?
I don't have any updates either.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. But just in case folks aren't familiar with it, the criticality score is a fantastic tool that is built and currently being refined. I think they have their own work group, if I'm not mistaken, or they have their own recurring meetings. But we at OSTIF have been using the criticality score to guide our research and to help solve this problem of what are the critical projects, what data can we point to that we can refer to and say, hey, using this quantitative data method, we can determine a score or some metric for criticality. So it's a very cool tool. Check it out if you haven't already. Maybe in one of the calls, if Abhishek or one of them join, we can get a more up-to-date update on that. Next, we have security scorecards. Is there anybody who has any updates on the security scorecards project?
Yeah, I don't see anybody on the online that would also know. I should probably know more than I was ready to chat about.
No worries. I
let me-
mean, it is technically the first
try to
meeting of
think.
the year. I know a lot of
Yeah.
folks, especially November and December, taking some much needed time off. So I understand we'll be getting back into the swing of things. But the
Yeah.
security scorecards is a great tool too. Sorry, what was that, Jeff?
Yeah. I was just going to say, we do have a weekly, or actually it's bi-weekly meeting, more goal focused and engineering focused. And we're constantly trying to improve, the quality of the scores, and, adding new scores where as best practices are identified.
Very cool. Yeah, and just to give a quick overview of that project too, in case you're not familiar, the security scorecards is another similar project trying to add some metrics and some insight into security practices of different open source projects. So that's another one that we have used too as part of our research and to help guide resources and determining which projects are critical, and not only which projects are critical, but hopefully once we get there, taking that to the next step and, determining how we can help projects and where they can use resources. Okay, so no new updates on that. I'm guessing it's going to be a similar story with package feeds. I don't think we have anybody from that project here, unless I'm mistaken. Okay. Next, and is there any, and I guess we could do AllStar next since we have you here, Jeff. Are there any updates on AllStar?
Yeah, I mean, it's just been chugging along, fixing issues where people have feature requests and adding new features. I did add a new policy so that you can require that every repo in your organization has an owner, or has a person or group with an admin permissions, and it's not simply the org owner that has access. So this is a good way to find, abandoned repos where maybe the person who owned that repo has been removed from the org, and there's nobody really responsible for it. So that's a good policy you could use to try to find things that may be not up to date, somebody's not responsible for it, and could potentially be vulnerable due to that.
Very cool.
So that's a new one. We also added the ability for you to set to set a setting so that AllStar will fix your branch protection rather than just notify you. So if you have required branch protection settings on your GitHub org, if any repo is out of spec, AllStar will go ahead and just make the changes to bring it back into spec. So those are two recent features. We're doing some planning as well, and planning for primarily a performance upgrade. So it's been running mostly with the original proof of concept or MVP architecture, which is a little slow to update all the repositories with whatever alerts they need. And we'll be moving to a more robust architecture based on webhooks to get it a lot more responsive.
Very cool. Thank you for that, Jeff.
And just just one more thing. We have been discussing AllStar features and planning in that scorecards meeting. So maybe we need to update the name of that meeting, but it's on the community calendar. It's every other Thursday. So that's another place to come and talk about AllStar in more detail if you're more interested.
Hey, quick question.
Mhm.
On the first, I got to confess, I'm not as familiar. I mean, I haven't actually dived as deeply into AllStar, but you're saying
Yeah.
one of the updates was a policy which allowed you to identify projects that don't have an authorized like maintainer. Is that the way to, or any is? Did I get that right?
Yeah, exactly. So in GitHub, your settings are, right, and then above right is administrator, which has access to changing all the settings of the repository. So the policy, as it's written, you can turn it on, and it'll flag any repository that doesn't have any group or user assigned to the repository as an administrator. Now, the organization administrators always have administrator rights on every repository in the organization, but it ignores that. So it wants to make sure that you have an actual person assigned.
Yeah, I'm kind of. I thought the architecture of the thing was that maybe I'm getting this confused with Toto, but that it's like that it was associated with GitHub Actions, and so is there something that runs periodically to check for repos which are not don't have an identified?
No, so it's not an action. It's just a GitHub app you install, and
I see.
then it runs periodically in the
I see.
in the OpenSSF infrastructure to check all the repositories that have AllStar installed.
Got it. That explains it. Thank you.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that update, Jeff.
Yeah.
Next, there's the OSTIF managed audit program. I don't have a ton of updates on that, just that we are making progress on the security engagements that we announced back in September, November. As you all probably know quite well, November and December, a lot of folks were out with vacation, holidays, and whatnot. So definitely getting back into the swing of things, getting some good stuff planned for Q1. Next is something in the topic of what we've been talking about the last couple meetings, which is identifying critical projects. So there have been some updates made to that list. I know this is definitely a work in progress. There were some very good suggestions in the GitHub repository for some updates that can be made to make this more I guess accessible and easier. So just want to, I just saw these today, the issues, GitHub issues, essentially 39 through 46. So haven't gotten to those just yet, but I definitely agree that, as part of what we're working on in identifying critical projects, the process, we should also work on refining the process and doing it as best as we can possibly give it our best shot. And I definitely think that the concept of curation, or basically open sourcing it, working within this work group and the OpenSSF and the open source community at large, is probably the best way to achieve that. I did add a number of suggestions from GitHub issue number 36. I believe that was Marta's. Yes, Marta's suggestions. Looks like Marta's not here today, but it was just a bunch of suggestions to add to our list for consideration as critical projects. So thank you for that. The whole idea is to source from diverse viewpoints. So those were added as community additions. The next update I have regarding that is I took kind of an initial stab at something we talked about in terms of kind of taking it one step further, which would be some kind of prioritization or classification of projects, including the feedback from, I believe that was from Arnaud at the last meeting, to put in a summary page to kind of describe everything in one place. So I definitely would love, I'd love the work group's thoughts and comments and contributions to this. If you have any thoughts or feedback, I'm definitely working on making it accessible so that, you know, folks can suggest updates and have the ability to do that in an easy way so that, you know, we can iterate on it and make it as refined as possible. So with that being said, I don't want to take up too much time talking about this specifically. I think it does require a little bit more, maybe some more dedicated time on its own working on this. So just to complete my general update, so some updates have been made, taking an initial step to kind of prioritizing or classifying projects once they have been identified as critical, trying to find a way to further essentially classify the projects. So with that, that's all the kind of the recurring updates we have. I thought as part of, especially as part of opening the new year, and I did see a good suggestion from Michael Wisner. I don't believe he's here today. Is Michael here today? Sorry, I don't want to assume. No, it doesn't look like it. Okay, so suggested as part of a topic idea, the idea of basically tracking progress, something like adoption, etc., of our projects. So I don't know if the work group agrees that's something we can talk about today, just a way that we can do that throughout the year, maybe check in on how things are going. I do really like the idea of these weekly updates. I think especially if we capture some notes on as to how progress is going, you know, we have a repository that we can refer back to. But if there are other ways that we can track progress of the projects that we're doing so that, you know, when we have town hall meetings and we talk about, you know, when people ask, you know, when folks come back to us and ask like, so what did the work group, so what progress has the work group made, we can come back with some concrete numbers and details. So that's just a couple of thoughts. I want this to be, you know, democratic. So any thoughts or feedback is more than welcome. So I'll open the floor to thoughts and feedback.
You know, I like your idea of wanting to look at which projects are actually adopting, you know, best practices and things like that. But I'm kind of, and along those lines, what it made me think about is, you know, we put in a lot of effort in a sprint at the end of the year to try to, you know, identify projects which ought to be using, you know, additional authentication. So we said this token, you know, here, let's identify a list of folks who could get a free token. Do we have any kind of take on how, you know, what was the uptake of that? Did that, you know, result in, I don't know, any idea?
I personally don't. I think David Wheeler would be the person to talk to. He kind of spearheaded that project. I do believe a good amount of tokens did go out by the end of the year, thanks to our efforts, yes.
Yeah.
But we can sit on that, and when David gets back for the next meeting, I would be curious too, as well. That's a good question.
It might be. I mean, I don't know whether. I mean, just getting a token is good. I'm just sort of wondering if, you know, people are actually using it, you know, implemented it or something like that. That would be a good question. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think getting them the tokens was probably a good first step, but you're absolutely right. Maybe if there's a way we could gain insight as to how many were actually used, how many are still being used, that would certainly help to see, you know, if that's worth the effort in a future iteration. Absolutely. But yeah, good question. We'll definitely talk with David about that next time.
Okay, so I noticed he wasn't in the meeting, but he's back next time.
Yeah, I believe he just had a conflict for this specific time slot. So yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Dave. Anyone else? Love to hear from you.
Is there any sense in which we can rely on the tools that are built, like AllStar? You know, rolling up AllStar figures or scorecard figures?
That's a good question. Yeah, we certainly used. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question. Had some noise over here. Sorry.
I was asking whether we can roll up AllStar figures in some way as at least one sort of pool of metrics?
Yeah, I do have installation numbers. I have to pull them, so I don't have them off the top of my head, but that would be something to do. Where do you think we should track these or report these?
Is it possible to use LFX security for this purpose? And LFX reporting capability, not security, but the other parts of LFX for the actual metrics, how it pulls in a lot of the metrics. Has anyone else used that feature in LFX? In the Linux Foundation?
I'm familiar with LFX. I haven't personally used the security reporting. Do you know like what?
I mean, yeah, security was on the top of my head, but I mean, in general, security versus just generalized project metrics, it's pretty robust and has a lot of new capabilities. It might be worth looking at if, rather than reinventing the wheel, leveraging a tool within the foundation that's just readily available.
Absolutely. Do you know if LFX security has any ways that you can access any of that data, or is it something you have to be a project using LFX to access?
Well, LFX in and of itself has a metrics dashboard. The security component is fairly new, and it incorporates things like SNCC and Blue Bracket and other things to actually do vulnerability and other scanning. So it's less about metrics. But just in general, the LFX metrics dashboards for what you're suggesting here to provide, periodic understanding of downloads and, project progress, and as far as adoption and other capabilities might be something to research. It might be worth looking into. Security is a kind of a separate conversation, but it's still, still relevant in the topic of OSF or OSFF.
Yeah, that's a good point. We tried to incorporate what we called selection criteria. So be able to point to something to be able to justify, why Ansible, for example, should be on our list of critical projects. So I could see if there's data outputs like you mentioned, I could see that being a selection criteria, just another data point to consider. So yeah, thank you for that. Has anyone else used any of these tools or familiar with anything that might help? I mean, Jacques, I like your question about the security scorecards, because I feel like that could potentially provide insight into actually figuring out how to help projects.
Yeah, it'd also give us a sense of like what you might call the water level, or where the water table is in terms of security practices. You could look for things that are lagging, particular indicators that are falling behind, things that turn out to be easier and harder, and do we focus on those? For example, like, if branch protection stays stubbornly low, why is that so? What feedback do we give to GitHub, etc.?
Yeah. I think that could be a potential good kind of workshop or something we could do as a work group, even where we could say, for this half of today's meeting, we're gonna just all hop on scorecards and see what we can come up with. If you all think that would potentially be a good use of our time, but I like that. I think there is potential insight to be found from the security scorecards in particular, because it does look at a good number of metrics and selection criteria. Okay, so I'll put that as a potential maybe activity, like work group activity, called security scorecards analysis. But yeah, that's a very good point. And another point I wanted to bring up that just to see what the work group thinks about it is, it does seem like curating and maintaining a list of critical projects is something of value. It's something of value to, I know, to other projects, to other OpenSSF projects, and just in general. I mean, you look at NIST and you look at what a lot of folks seem to be focused on. We want to improve the open source ecosystem, but we don't know where to look. And so if we could curate something that could be a data point or something that is curated by us as a group and is essentially open sourced, if that's something that makes sense for us to continue to do as a work group and to dedicate, a portion of our work group meetings to working on. I just would like to hear what the work group has to say about that, and something that, and it's something of value that we could provide to the open source community as a whole, to the OpenSSF, to really, I think there is a lot of value in it, but that's just my opinion. So I'd love to hear what the work group has to say, and if this is worth continuing to put our time into.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really valuable. I think, it seems like our focus has mostly been on identifying those projects which are both critical and sort of under-maintained or underproduced, I think was some of the terminology of one of those research papers we looked at, right? So while, and some critical projects may be on the list and may fall into that state of being underproduced, right? I could think of a lot of Java projects that, were at one time, very well produced, and then, kind of over time, that's kind of, slipped. And, now you got the log4j, stuff, right? So, which is like the perfect example of a critical project. No one was really thinking about it as being particularly critical, but then it was like, oops, it is pretty underproduced. So to summarize, I guess, Amir, it would be, are you looking for, the critical projects or the underproduced critical projects?
I think the objective first and foremost is, without getting too into the nitty gritty, is identifying critical open source projects.
Okay.
The underproduction paper was one of the data points used to help guide, which projects were critical. So yeah, I think first and foremost, it's projects are critical. And I think you'll find through that process, you will also find a lot of projects that are probably underproduced, or that are deprecated, or that, do a very simple function, but have been around for 10 years and are in everything, but have never been reviewed before. So I think, in my opinion, the objective is really first and foremost, regardless of, I don't think you'll ever get full consensus on, what's critical, which ones are the most critical, but just to answer, this is our best take at which projects are critical. It might not be all of them. It's probably a good representative sample of them.
I think this becomes more and more relevant in the context of proprietary tooling, which, even most proprietary tooling uses a lot of them use outdated open source, package libraries, because their release cycle is not necessarily agile. It can, take, some of them are still every 3 months, 6 months for larger development sets. And they don't necessarily think about things like log4j or others. And well, certainly a lot of them are now. But being able to point them in the right direction for this at a broader scale, and providing either a list to start with of things that should be scanned, and then eventually, I realize it's a different working group, but tools to automate the the governance around finding, using this list is a potential first step, and potentially automating off this list to hit these more regularly would be an ideal outcome, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the objectives of having a list like this, is to kind of help guide resource decisions, and just to help point resources to where they're needed more, where they can make a bigger outcome. I know they always say hindsight is 20/20, but if you go back in our work group meetings, when I first presented our OSTIF stuff back in July of last year, we did have a couple of the logging frameworks on our list. They come up in the Harvard research a lot too, because they're everywhere and they've been around for a long time. And with that many components, you really can't review them all, but, at least we knew we were barking up the right tree. And hopefully with something like this, when something big like this happens, a crisis, so to speak, hopefully the response will be more resources, more review of this kind of stuff to prevent this from happening again. Do we have any other feedback on or thoughts about just the general using our time to curate and maintain a list of critical projects?
Yeah, I'm in support of that. I think that's clearly shown that it's useful with both this Great MFA project and Alpha Omega project. And I think there will be more to come. I think also just want to point out to everybody, because not everybody was in the previous meeting, we did have a goal discussion in that meeting and updated our goals a little bit. It's in the doc if you scroll down to the December 16th meeting, where we did kind of narrow our goals a little bit towards identifying projects as being the primary goal of this group. But of course, this is fluid and up to the group. So it's something that we can revisit if we need to.
Okay. 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 So with that, we're at 36 past the hour. We could take about 15 minutes or so. We could discuss some of the candidate projects and kind of go through our process of providing feedback and kind of going through the work group. So I'll pull that up and I'll put a link as well, because I know apparently there were some access issues. I'm really trying to fix that. So please let me know if you're having any issue accessing this document. But so the way I currently have it broken down, and again, if anyone has any comments or thoughts on how to improve this, this is all a work in progress. But currently there is the critical projects tab. So this is essentially the list, so to speak. These are the ones that have gone through all of our discussions, and they have selection criteria to back them, and we as a work group at least don't disagree and think it's worthy of being critical. Then you have the summary tab, which was my initial attempt at addressing some feedback as to if someone who doesn't know anything about us or this were to come across this, would they know what it is? So I put in a summary. The prioritization is the very nascent part where that we could probably get to. That deserves probably a whole session on its own. But again, if you have any comments or want to put any notes in there, that would be great. The next tab is candidate projects. This is meant to be the sheet that captures kind of the discussion forum where projects are to be discussed by us, the work group, and justified to be critical or not. Just to go through the whole worksheet. Next, you have the selection criteria. So, we definitely want to demonstrate that we are not just pulling stuff out of our butts, as they say, or just making stuff up. We try to use qualitative and quantitative data, with the selection criteria being a brief explanation of some of those tools. Next is the community/open SSF member additions. So this is kind of the backlog, so to speak. So this is where people have suggested many things. One of the GitHub issues had a bunch of new projects that were recommended. We had a good suggestion from Docker pull count data reports on that, to get some more candidates on there. And then there's survey responses. So there is a Google form. It's a public survey, an anonymous public survey, which I have provided a link to it in the top. So feel free to use that yourself or to share that with people. Again, to just get as many diverse viewpoints as we can. But that's a general overview of the sheet and the current process. Again, I would love to iterate this and make it in a way that is efficient and, that pleases or that works for as many people as possible. I know we'll never please everybody, but so yeah, that's kind of the general process right now. So as you could see in candidate projects, we do have about 25 that one of them being package managers, which is very vague. So that almost requires almost a session on its own or a discussion on its own. But the rest of them being, projects that are recommended one way or another, make it past kind of the first round of kind of review and review. And then, it's up to discussion and to help us justify whether it belongs on the list or not. So let me see where we're at with time. We're at 41. Okay, we could take at least 10 minutes to talk about some of these. So the first one we have is, if we can come to a conclusion today, we have Metasploit framework. So this was originally, I believe, chosen because of the criticality score. Looks like based on our initial discussions, someone mentioned that this is used only in testing and not production, which is, I think, something to factor. So do we have any thoughts or objections or really anything on this package Metasploit framework? Is anyone familiar with it or its development, security practices, really anything?
I know very little about Metasploit. It is supported by Rapid7, who are sort of a security consultancy. The reason I'm familiar with it is that it's one of the very few signed collections of Ruby gems. That's how it first came to my notice. When I ran the numbers on which gems are actually signed, there's just not very many. And this one stood out because it's a whole family of gems that are signed.
Yeah, but Metasploit is like a hacking tool, right?
Yeah, it's a framework, I believe, that you have plugins and you can get it to do all sorts of different things.
Yeah. So this was when we were kind of chuckling a little bit in the last meeting, because it was like, okay, is it critical infrastructure? It's a little odd. I mean, I think my pen testing team probably uses it, but to do hacking, it's a little odd though on the list. So anyway, that was, I think, the chuckle.
It's kind of an interesting proposal because it's kind of a secondary critical project in terms of security, because it is a pen testing framework. Like if something goes awry in Metasploit and it's compromised, then security teams might also be compromised. So it's a second order critical project. Though I don't think we have a framework for that.
And I always go back to, or at least consider, the question of supply chain, open source supply chain. And it doesn't seem it doesn't seem to pertain too closely to that, but I could be wrong.
Yes, this sort of highlights that we might need to work out whether we bias some environments over others. So, for example, there's a lot of focus on things that show up at production time. Sure, they show up elsewhere, but production time is where we're really worried about, because then they get access to production assets. And then you can imagine other ones where you're worried because they show up at CI time and can harvest secrets or interfere with production. And that's like another loop outside. And then the third one outside that is like getting access to development environments. But all of them seem to flow back to, we care about ensuring the integrity of production, that nothing naughty makes its way into production.
Which, I mean, or
go ahead.
No, finish your thought.
Well, I was going to say, if that's the framework, then Metasploit sort of falls back to that second or third order, as Julia was saying.
I guess my opinion on that, and kind of an approach that we've been looking at, is it's really more about pre-production, trying to mitigate the potential for issues in production by incorporating as many possible touch points prior to release to, certainly pen testing of a production application is a relevant context. But if you have the right processes, best practices, automation of vulnerability checks, and n number of other component things that can be done, certainly having this criticality list, which will drive vulnerability checks more frequently, as well as better development practices. Don't use libraries that you haven't vetted internally, things like that. And the list kind of goes on and is being developed by these varied groups. I think production is obviously the end goal, but my understanding of what a lot of the industry is really trying to do is to avoid having any of those issues, or having a pen test come up with nearly nothing, almost nothing in its tests, because we've done enough of the due diligence up front. Right.
Yeah.
So that is the kind of the question of production is important, but it's really the processes from initial check-in and development all the way to pre-production release, where we should be finalizing all of the scope of our efforts.
Yeah. I agree with Eric, Julia. I think it's it's sort of, we shouldn't drop it. I mean, we shouldn't lose it. I mean, yeah, if a pen test team got exploited, that wouldn't be awesome. However, I do think there's probably hotter things to put focus on.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great consideration too, because I think that since that's the goal, I think kind of coming up with the most critical things, that should, I think, maybe be the strongest guide. But you bring up a good point about what point in the development process should we focus on most.
So before the break, we were really kind of looking at the most critical and kind of with an unsaid goal of getting around 100 projects, because that's what the MFA was looking for. Now we're at a different time, and as we mentioned, maybe we need to consider these projects that are at a different tier. I noticed, I hate to derail a little bit, but I noticed you had the selection. No, sorry, not selection criteria. What was it? The summary tab. You started a prioritization. Does it make sense to look at that first and think, like, what priority are we looking at right now, and should we expand, or should we just to limit ourselves to that high priority now? And in that case, we probably would say no to this project.
Right.
Another thought bubble, I like what you're thinking about, a strict priority. Some of it might also help if we kind of categorize these things a little bit. So, you could, for example, say something like KVM hypervisor, right? That's an example of something that's open source, it's used, all over the place, right? Versus make. The make command is used to produce, whatever flavor of make you're using, right? So there's like the production, the supply chain thing, the dev tools or whatever. If you exploit one of those, potentially it's a huge impact. But it's a different class of thing. It's not like it's different priority, but it's like a different category. So there's both. So categorization might be a little bit easier than prioritization, right? We might have far fewer disagreements. The other thing along those same lines, by the way, is this is a little Jeff, let's say, it was a little bit of a, not right on topic, but it was great you clicked through the tabs of the sheet, because I looked at the community, tab, right? Community OpenSSF member additions tab. I was like, oh yeah, Yocto project's in there, which is used to build, Yocto project, build, root, U-boot. These are used to build tons of Internet of Things stuff, right? Which, if BitBake, which is a project within Yocto project, got exploited, it'd be like you wouldn't be able to know because it's produced all kind of exploited, Linux distributions out there that people are using to build devices with. So, but it doesn't appear on any of the other tabs. That was the thing. From a process standpoint, I'm like, okay, we had this feedback that these things are important. And I was like, well, yeah, super important. Why aren't they on one of the lists?
Well, maybe we're doing something right if it ended up on there. So
it didn't wind up on a list that was ones we're working on. It's on a community input list. See what I'm saying? What are we doing to migrate those things that community has told us these are critical and migrate them onto the list we're actually working on?
Right. That's part of what we're working on as a work group. Yeah. So ideally they'll go from, just general additions. So like they are in this tab to the candidate projects. And then, we'll discuss as a work group and, if a good case can be made, yay or nay, and then it gets onto the list. Ideally, I like to essentially ingest from as many points as possible, go through, one or two iterations of, some kind of analysis, and then come up with our candidate projects. And then to get back to your question, Jeff, about my take as to prioritization, that was really just what came, that was my kind of take onto it. It's the reason I put TBD is because I definitely would like, all of your input and work together as a work group. I think that's something that will require a good amount of dedicated time. So maybe that's something we can put as a future topic idea. I think David David Wheeler would want to participate in that discussion too. But I think, yeah, the categorization / prioritization, that's going to be probably a natural next step, in addition to, maintaining and curating this list of critical projects. But I really think, like a lot of things in open source, by open sourcing it, by, allowing the work group folks to comment and to edit and to make changes, I think that's probably going to be the best way to get, a good representative list that represents, a good amount of diverse viewpoints. So I'm going to put that as a future topic idea to discuss prioritization and categorization. And then
yeah, so to bring it back then, pending like a better prioritization, get going on like the bar that we had been using before the break, I would say a no to Metasploit based on like the idea that we've been focusing on
oh yes,
things that will impact production directly or indirectly.
I'd also just bring up as a point of order that we've got a hand raised on Zoom.
Who does?
Oh, sorry, that's me.
Oh, no worries at all. Would you like to?
Yeah, as far as prioritization goals, one of the things that occurs to me, and I don't know if there's been prior discussion about this, but one thing that's probably very relevant is the existing resources a project already has, because, right, like I see the Linux project is up on this list, and I think essentially everyone in the industry knows that that's important, and they have a lot of resources behind them. And up next on candidate projects is Docker, which has a corporate company backing them, and same goes for Ubuntu with Canonical and so on and so forth. So I don't know if there's been prior discussion about this, so I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, that actually is awesome, because that's kind of what I was thinking when I took this kind of first stab at prioritization. I definitely think it's going to be pretty important to differentiate which projects are, like the graphic and that we all see, that one project that's holding up everybody, that's run by one or two people. We want to be able to identify those projects that have essentially no resources. What I called those were tier 0. I wrote tier 0 projects are volunteer run and have little to no dedicated resources. And as you go up, you get higher amounts of dedicated resources, the highest being, this is a Google project that has, dedicated resources assigned to it. So it'll help us. I think that'll be great to help guide the discussion of how do we prioritize where resources go.
Yeah.
Or
I mean, but that was the point I was making earlier, is our goal to identify critical projects, or to identify critical projects which are underproduced. And I think it's not either or, it's both and, is what our earlier conversation was, right? So no one would question that Linux is not a critical project. No one would also argue that it's underproduced. It's thoroughly well produced. So it's not either or, it's both and, I think, from what I heard gathered earlier.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I'm fine with that was the conclusion of the earlier conversation of this meeting, right? And so I was like, okay, and you may have something which is critical today and falls into the underproduced category, over time, right? Because this should never be sort of a static analysis. I think this analysis needs to happen continuously, and because some things fall in and out of favor over time, right?
Agreed. Yep.
I can suggest that we can frame this as a like on a risk-based approach. Some of them we are including because we're concerned about the magnitude, the event magnitude. So for example, like your Dockers and your Linux kernels, the magnitude of exploit is very high. Some of them we're interested because of the frequency. So how frequently something will go wrong. So for example, a project that is underproduced will have, we're saying, causally would have a higher frequency of bad things happening because there are fewer people looking, fewer people able to respond. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, it's a both and kind of a thing. It's like the cross product of underproduced and critical and heavily used, either in terms of the number of times it's included or the number of times it runs, right? Those are that cross product, absolutely, or if you will, the overlap of those two sets is it should be the highest. That should be the highest priority.
If we take a frequency magnitude like cross product, to use your terminology, then we have the advantage that it becomes commensurate across all projects rather than considering them on two different axes, which leads to a sort of like a frontier, which is hard to figure out how things should be prioritized.
Sorry to use the computer science terminology about cross product. I remember it from graduate
Hey, I love
school.
databases too. It's cool.
I couldn't remember how I couldn't tell you what the definition of is, but I think I'm using it correctly.
Cool, wonderful. Well, it looks like we've got a couple minutes left, 3 by my count. I'd like to first thank everybody for a nice discussion today. It's nice to see everyone's faces and get back into the swing of things for this year. Also, so we got a couple things in for potential future topics to kind of go into in more detail. If anyone else has anything that they ever want to talk about or present, please feel free to throw that up in the future topic ideas. And with the last 2 minutes, I like to, have a little bit of a cushion just in case someone didn't get a chance to say something they wanted to say, or, just kind of leave that last minute or two open for kind of any last remarks if anyone wanted to say something. So with that,
I'll throw one in real quick for the recording. Colleagues of mine at Shopify have opened an RFC submission for Ruby Gems, which would introduce a policy that top gem owners would need to have MFA enabled as a matter of requirement. So if you're watching the recording, you can find a link in the meeting notes.
Wonderful, thank you.
I had a question. There was a mention earlier of a separate meeting discussing the criticality score. Can I get a reference for that? I'm a little curious to maybe join that one.
Yeah, I think I could find it in their GitHub repo. So I'll put it in the meeting notes.
Yeah, I didn't see it on the calendar, so I had the same question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There's a small chance maybe I made that up, or I thought I saw it, but I swear I saw it on the calendar to discuss criticality score. But yeah, if there's I'll put in any links next to the updates and the meeting notes.
I'll ask Abhishek to and update the meeting notes as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff. Okay, looks like we're at noon on the dot. So, or noon for me, sorry. But thanks so much, everybody. Great discussion today. And I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.